Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Multifamily Talks. Today's guest was Steve Pribonic with White Oak Partners. Steve and I had a really lively discussion about some trends in the capital market space, how White Oak is assessing the 2024 landscape, and we also get into some personal questions about how those starting out in the industry can approach advancement in their careers and what to look for as we move forward into the 2020 cycle. So we hope you enjoy the discussion, and thanks for joining. Before we even get started, thanks for joining. Really genuinely appreciate it. Good to catch up with you, and hopefully our travel plans will cross again here soon.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Carl.
Yeah, likewise. So when you and I were talking here a few months back, we were talking a little bit about the landscape of college football. And, you and I are pretty avid college football fans. Just curious to get some of your thoughts. As of recording this today, the college football playoff rankings just released right before bowl season. So just curious to get your thoughts on the state of the college football landscape there.
Yeah. It's definitely a big point of emphasis for me sitting in Columbus, Ohio, especially as a Buckeye grad. It's a focus of myself and really everybody in the area. Obviously, Ohio State failed to make the Final Four this year. Still, it's hard to call 11-1 season a total failure, but it's always fun. And then, today with the transfer portal kicking off and even our starting quarterback jumping in there, it's a wild time. Time to be a fan.
I didn't even hear about it. I knew the portal opened today, but I didn't even hear about that. That must be recent as of the past few hours then.
Yeah. First thing this morning. So he wasn't, I guess he wasn't guaranteed the job going forward, and he didn't like that. So
got it.
He's out.
Got it. Yeah, that would be a hard job being a college football head coach. Just there's a lot of things to take into consideration. I can't imagine the pressure at one of those big schools like Ohio State that you feel from the fan base.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining. And, I guess that's probably a decent segue here into the background. Steve Pribonic, White Oak Partners. We'll talk about the intro here in a second, but just give us a little bit about your background. Who is Steve? What does Steve do for White Oak Partners? And then here in a second, we'll kick it over to what it is that White Oak Partners does.
Sure. So, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, born into a farming family. So, hard work is just the expectation in that type of setting, as I know Carl. Graduated from Ohio State into the GFC, graduating into a recession, not recommended, but I was able to continue working. I worked my way through Ohio State as an apprentice electrician, so I was able to continue doing that, spend a little time in banking here in Columbus, and all the while I was coaching. Which is something that has been a skill set that's been extremely valuable to me today as I'm growing and developing young people in their positions at White Oak. So my role today, I work in capital markets, which means that 50% of my job is focused on talking to investors, explaining the ins and outs of what we have as far as opportunities go and how White Oak thinks about risk. The other 50% of my job is people development. So I managed our research team and our marketing team, and we used both of those teams as kind of a gateway, an entry point for folks who have extremely talented backgrounds and interest in real estate, but not necessarily the full skill set to be successful in even an entry level position in a lot of other places.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you said that, because I've had the privilege of working with y'all's team quite a bit over really a few years now, and I've seen kind of that organic pipeline that y'all have generated where someone's working on, say, the research team, which just happens to be the group that I interface the most with, and it's really cool to see how y'all have fostered this community of development within the company, and you really can see a path forward based on past precedent of employees who have made that path.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a lot of success there, and I think it's been a great segue for us, and I know we're going to continue going forward.
Yeah, and you and I were talking just right before the podcast kicked off here. It's so interesting that a few of the guests that I've had on thus far that have been actually, I guess I would say even exclusively research focused. I think your perspective's a little bit more broad beyond just the research component. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But one thing I've noticed within the research arena in particular is that there's a lot of overlap with um, uh, folks in this space that have either gone on to get their masters. So clearly this component of continuing education, this almost insatiable curiosity for whatever industry you're in, but then there's also this big overlap with people who have either got their kind of cut their teeth in the education arena, or in other words, were teachers in a past life, or have continued to do something in coaching and teaching even today, kind of parallel to what they're doing for their day-to-day work.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I've noticed the same thing myself. I think that it really has to do with communication styles and having a lot of experience, making sure that whoever it is you're communicating with understands what the point is that we're trying to get across.
Right. Yep. Totally understand. So we've got a little bit about a little bit of your background there, and again, appreciate you sharing. But I did want to talk a little bit about White Oak Partners, what it is, what White Oak Partners does. Can you give us kind of that 30,000 foot view of the company there?
Sure, of course. Yeah, so White Oak Partners is an institutional owner operator that focuses on multifamily. And we invest in primarily suburban multifamily throughout the best locations in growth markets. Another differentiator, I'll say, of White Oak is that we are consistently focused on understanding the residents of a specific asset in a specific location.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I think we'll probably have, by the time this releases, maybe 24 podcasts that are out there ready to release. And one of the most common themes I've heard, especially for 2024, is the resident experience. And that works both from the perspective of operators who can curb some of these costs for turnover, can curb the fact that a lot of supply is coming on the way, and you and I are going to talk a little bit about supply here in a minute, I'm sure. But also from the resident experience, if you can engage the residents and they have a better experience, not only does that inherently lift the quality of how they view their experience at that particular property, but it increases the stickiness rate as well. And I think that that's something that you're seeing more and more as the industry matures, is more focus on those types of things.
Yeah. I mean, I would make it as simple as saying it's a community, right? And when people feel like they're part of a community and they want to stay, you end up making friends, and it's a lifestyle driver that a lot of folks are definitely prioritize.
Yeah, one of my colleagues who's far more experienced in the day-to-day operation side of things put this to me in this way, and I never really thought about it. But he said, when you think about the number of people in an apartment that have a pet, if they have a friend there who also has a pet, I forgot what the exact number was. We had it in our renter study, but there was a huge increase in the propensity of that resident renewing. And it really comes back to exactly that, the community side of things, as opposed to what I think outside industry sees as, well, here's a corporation that's managing this asset. It's not necessarily an asset. It is from an investment perspective, but most importantly, from a truly engaging the residents, it is a community first approach that I think more and more groups are rightfully taking.
Yeah, totally agree.
So looking at the White Oak footprint, can you just kind of, you talked a little bit about the suburban footprint, some of the best locations. I've had the privilege of presenting to y'all's team a couple times here, and I've personally been big fans of y'all's footprint for a few years now, even being willing to take on some of those up and coming markets that aren't necessarily in the 50 largest of the nation. But I think there's a ton of opportunity in that 50, we call it market 50 through market 100. What are some key markets that y'all are focused on today that you could share with our audience?
Sure. So, look, our main primary markets for investment are Atlanta and Dallas. But then, we expand to Charlotte, Nashville, a lot of places throughout the Southeast and Southwest. But outside that box that is pretty common in the industry today, we're in Colorado Springs. We're in Minneapolis, Philadelphia, and strategically we'll go into Greenville, South Carolina, some of these smaller markets where liquidity is a concern to some extent. But we definitely want to make sure that we have our arms wrapped around that type of risk before we would move into that market, because the dynamics are just different in a market of 500,000 in population instead of 3 or 4 million like some of our other larger markets that we focus on typically.
Yeah, the differences between those are pretty significant from a transactions perspective, and but to your point, I think something that we've seen over the past cycle, but I think especially as we get into the 2020s, is the viability, the attractiveness of those Colorado Springs, the Greenvilles of the world. That's going to continue to become more and more powerful. Now, the Philadelphia one is interesting to me because I think that in some ways, even though it's one of the nation's biggest markets from a population perspective, it really only seems like in the past 5 to maybe 10 years, maybe not even that long, maybe even 5, that you're starting to see a lot more broad-based interest from a development and an investment perspective there. What are some of y'all's thoughts there in the Philadelphia market? I'm just kind of curious from a researchy perspective, because it's been coming up on our radar more and more lately.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think that part of the challenge with Philadelphia is, you've got urban Philadelphia, which is kind of a totally different market than the suburban King of Prussia area that we primarily focus on. There aren't going to be very many of our residents out in that location that are commuting downtown Philadelphia, right? They might go to an Eagles game here and there, but for all the other intents and purposes, their life is in the suburbs. So that's where we want to really understand the supply demand dynamics and differentiators property to property.
Yeah, the property thing is something that's really interesting to me, and admittedly something that I think my particular role probably misses out on, is that we're looking at markets, maybe submarkets too to some degree, but from a very 30,000 foot level. At the end of the day, when you're talking about these markets, oftentimes you're looking at a few key street corners within those markets where your assets are actually situated. So I think that that's something that, the boots on the ground understanding, to have that internally, a resource such as yourself for both investors and your internal teams is something that's really, really hard, if not impossible, to replace.
Well, that's good. I'll invite you into my year-end review, Carl. That's great.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on year-end reviews on behalf of an outsider's perspective. So you did mention the capital markets there, and of course your background at the company is largely capital markets focused. I'm personally a level or two removed from that side of the equation. So, what are some key trends that you're seeing in the market from that acquisitions perspective in today's landscape?
Sure. So I think the number one topic in capital markets and in acquisitions and transaction activity, it really has to do with distress. And, I think there's a wide bid-ask spread throughout the market at this moment in time. But there's a lot of conviction for investing in multifamily. There's a lot of interest from both market participants and institutional investors today. I think what we've found so far is that distress is more of a function of an individual asset being poorly positioned, an individual owner, operator, or developer that has something going on. A lot of times it's multi-asset classes, right? So the multifamily isn't the problem, but to fix some problems in office or elsewhere, their focus is going ahead and getting some liquidity through multifamily. So I think that's been the distress landscape that we're largely seeing today.
Yeah, I like that you position it like that, and just helping hear that kind of mirrors what we're seeing from a markets trend, where you see that performance has slowed today. Rent growth is basically at a 10-year low. Occupancy is still healthy by long-term norms, but it is obviously down from where it was, say, this time last year. But what's really important is that when you zoom out and look at a lot of the fundamentals in the market, the demand side of the equation, for example, is actually still pretty strong today. occupancy, sure, it's down year over year, but if you drew a 10-year line in a lot of these markets, we're not necessarily at a point that's a cause for concern. Occupancy is kind of finding an equilibrium after that run up in 2021 and 2022 that we never thought was going to be fully sustainable. So I think really, if I could summarize the capital market side there, I think what you might be seeing is that the murmurs of distress tend to be more of a isolated, anecdotal thing as opposed to a broad-based industry trend, at least within the multifamily arena.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a great summary.
It's something that we're getting more and more questions about as well, and especially as we get our 2024 outlook released here in the next few weeks, we'll be updating our forecast. But looking at some of the recent monthly data here, the performance trends, sure, they don't look like they did the same time last year, but in some ways that's actually a good thing because we're not seeing as much of a seasonal slowdown in 4Q23 as we did in 4Q 2022. And I think really we're just reapproaching and reworking back through some stabilization in the market.
Yeah. Again, that matches our experience.
So as you're talking to some of your internal teams, especially on the research side, what are some trends that they're seeing in the market? What are some key things you're seeing from a performance perspective or perhaps a supply perspective? What are 2 or 3 nuggets of wisdom you could give our audience this afternoon?
Sure. Well, I won't share too much of the secret sauce, but I guess what we're focused on at all times, but definitely hyper focused on today, is the residents' income resiliency. Where do folks work? What do those industries look like in some sort of a recessionary environment? What types of risks are associated with that income? What the residents' rent to income ratio is? How much are they having to stretch to live in a specific asset? And we find that that's something that's best done at the individual asset level. Outside of that, I mean, supply is definitely top of mind. But as you said earlier, we're thinking about supply from the individual asset perspective. How will new supply at the market and submarket level likely impact operations on this specific asset, rather than thinking about the holistic supply demand dynamics at the market level? And then I think the last thing that our team is hyper focused on at this moment in time is just the physical asset itself, construction quality and suitability to the location, right? I mean, if you're talking about the type of property that would typically be found in, somewhere in Florida near the beach, you're not going to necessarily see that in suburban Philly. It just would seem out of place, and I think residents would treat it as if it's out of place. So things as simple as that, which again, I think we're focused on in any environment, but today we're taking an even deeper look at those concepts.
Yeah, really getting back down to basics and looking at a more site-specific level, and even going back to the Dallas and Atlanta example from earlier. You see these headline numbers. Dallas DFW has 70,000 units under construction. Atlanta's got 45,000, and I don't know if those numbers are exactly right, but those are market level. When you look at the geographic footprint of a Dallas or an Atlanta, what's happening in suburb A might not be impacting, and often isn't impacting, suburb B. So it really does come down to more of that zip code level, perhaps, or residents aren't necessarily thinking in terms of zip codes; they're thinking in terms of their residence and location to, say, a set of amenities. Maybe it's the nightlife or concerts, or more importantly, where they're working or who their employers are. And is that trend, where the employers are moving, for example, is that mirroring where a lot of the apartment development is happening?
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess the one thing that I would add there is school districts,
Okay.
especially as a suburban investor and operator. A lot of times residents are going to think in terms of school districts. We say the word submarket. That's not meaningful to anybody outside the industry, but understanding where your kids are going to go to school and trying a location out where you might potentially want to buy a home someday is kind of a big part of suburban investment.
Yeah, I love that you point that out. That's something that I think that, oftentimes looking at the data, when you hear a good school district, you think, well, sure, families that are living at a community and sending their kids to a nearby school, that's important. But I think it's really that second component that you touch on there that's the real driver of oftentimes the resident life cycle. As residents get to the point of those key life triggers of having kids and getting married, oftentimes that does signal, not necessarily exclusively, but often it does precede moving out to single family homes. But generally speaking, you don't make a move across the market, into a totally different part of town. You kind of have set some roots there already, and just like you said, you want to try an area on for size, and what better way to do that than renting an apartment for, call it 6 months on the short end to maybe 24 months if you've renewed your lease, one additional renewal cycle.
Sure. Yeah, we would totally agree.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting component. And that's something too, from a forecasting perspective, that's, it's almost impossible to forecast that. But when looking at an asset level, that's where, going back to the comment you made earlier about resident engagement, experience, communication, connection, that's how you can foster that at a more site specific level. And really what it comes down to, and ultimately what matters the most from the management side of things.
Yep, we agree.
All right, so I'm going to throw a curveball at you here. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. We talked a little bit about your background there, and actually still currently coaching. So let me throw this one at you. I've liked to include some comments or some questions for our guests here. Maybe it's for some folks that are newer to the industry and want to see what the path forward looks like. But for you specifically, what do you think you would be doing if you weren't currently working in multifamily?
Okay. I think when I was at Ohio State, that answer would have been commentating on football and basketball games. So I think that would be fun. I don't know that that's necessarily a job for me. Realistically, I think I'd still be in real estate. I just enjoy the ability to stand in the physical space and understand the ins and outs of the story of how somebody would use a specific property, and then being able to communicate that story to the ultimate user.
Yeah, and you said earlier too that you had some background in the banking arena, and that that's some near perfect overlap in many ways for what you're currently doing. So I think that real estate, from the perspective of somebody that's relatively new to the industry, real estate seems kind of ambiguous. But whenever you start getting further along the path, you realize, oh, there are all these different modes of application that you can use in the industry. We actually had one guest that we interviewed earlier in the year that made a good point, that said that when she was in college, sure, there's technically a real estate major, but even then it's usually tucked under the umbrella of business. And there's certainly not a major, at least to my knowledge, of multifamily apartments. You can't really major in multifamily. So when you look at the scale of this industry, and getting into it, you don't realize how many opportunities there are, and really the vastness of the industry. Certainly not at the collegiate age when you're just jumping off into that professional world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, that's where our solution with the research and marketing positions being a bit of a gateway has come into play, because we find a lot of young, hungry folks with a lot of great attributes, but not the right type of experience. So to fill that gap, we're bringing them up to speed in-house.
Yeah, it's almost like looking for the skills, or the ability to obtain certain skills, as opposed to starting fresh with that tool set. Because to your point, those are things that can be learned along the way if the willingness and the capability is there at the onset.
Absolutely.
So kind of similar on those same lines, think back 10, 15 years, especially as you were graduating into a recessionary market, which I imagine was a really scary time in a lot of ways. What would be some advice that you would give to someone who is, I guess, A, either looking to break into the industry, or B, somebody that's looking to further advance in the industry?
Sure. So yeah, and actually, I do find myself giving this advice quite commonly. So the handful of things that I always recommend to young folks: network with as many people as possible. And when I say that, I mean get to know them. have something to say. Don't just come up and, basically make the one-sided conversation of asking how somebody that's already in the industry can help you get a job. But get to know people. Part two, have the self-awareness to understand that you don't know what you don't know. So try everything you have the opportunity to try. A lot of times I'll end up talking to somebody that's their first year in a real estate program, and they already know exactly what they want to do, but they can't explain why, and they don't understand the hallmarks of the job. And right away that just kind of paints you in a little bit of a bad light with whoever it is you're talking to. And then the third one that I'm always highlighting with young folks is just work your tail off. I mean, if you show up every day and you bring a lot of energy and enthusiasm and get things done, it will be noticed. And I know that you'll be successful down the line if you're doing all three of those things, but especially the hard work portion.
Yeah, those first two things supplemented with hard work really seems to be the kind of the magic potion, if you will, that perfect little je ne sais quoi in the dish that I think gets overlooked candidly sometimes. But I really like your second comment there of trying on a lot of different things for size. And your background's probably similar in a lot of ways where your role hasn't necessarily been this linear set of steps that 2 years in, I will be doing this particular thing for this particular group. Oftentimes it feels a little bit non-linear and you kind of jump around, but by getting that broad-based breadth of experience and working across multiple facets of a company or an industry for that matter, I think is a really key way to approach, like you said, not only just starting in the industry, but advancing and really solidifying yourself.
Absolutely.
So looking forward to 2024, if you had to pick 2 or 3 things that you're really looking forward to for the industry, just at large, what would be some things that you think are coming up on the radar that excite you for the next 12 or so months?
Sure. So in 2024, the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to at this moment is just getting back to a normalized transaction environment. There's a competitive component to the real estate industry that we've been missing. And it's something that I'm really looking forward to as we get back to a more normal transaction activity environment. I think that's really number one.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard something similar in some regards of just looking forward to what things used to be like from the transactions perspective, because it hasn't just been this past year, it's been 2 or 3 years now, and on both the highs and the lows, it's been so we actually have a chart that we share sometimes that shows, now this is for rent growth, but how the past 4 years have been anything but normal on the high and the low side. And if you drew a dotted line for the 2010s average, I mean, it's like 4 outlier years, and the transaction market has mirrored that too. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens for in 24. I know the appetite is out there, and I think that that's one of the important components, is that the appetite to get into the market is out there from a transactions perspective. On top of that, when you zoom out again and look at some of those demand fundamentals, a lot of the demand fundamentals say that the market is heading in a really positive direction. We're just also seeing a lot of supply deliver right now. And this is how economic cycles tend to go. Demand is structural, supply is cyclical. Go back to any point over the past 40 years, and you'll see these points where supply starts to run a little bit ahead of demand. But the good news is that demand, at least our perspective, we don't see a scenario in which demand is going to be shortfalling supply for a long period of time.
Yeah, and I guess the only other piece of the equation that brings me confidence is if when the transaction activity environment gets back to normal. There are a lot of other healthy things going on in the economy, which should typically mean more household formation, just further supporting demand. So it all kind of goes together in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good way to look at the industry, from an educational perspective, where you're talking to your internal users, you're talking to folks out in the industry. You do look at some of those economic tailwinds, and you're like, oh yeah, job growth is still happening. By the way, it's still pretty strong. Population growth, it's still happening. Well, it's especially strong in a lot of those markets that you mentioned, especially that, call it 20 to 30-year-old cohort that's oftentimes renters. And then, additionally, you have the component that you mentioned as well, that when you start looking at different neighborhood dynamics, that's where you can get really powerful intel from, employers are in this area, or this is an up and coming area from a creation of place perspective, and those are the things that are hard to quantify. But I think over time, experience in the industry just kind of helps you pinpoint what it is between place and placemaking, and really the differentiators there.
Absolutely.
All right, Steve, so you've already been super gracious with your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, although we could keep the conversation going as long as we wanted. The last thing I did want to ask is anything you wanted to share with our audience, any final thoughts here as we sign off, any sage wisdom you'd like to impart amongst the group?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would just put a quick plug out there for our White Oak Insights. So I don't know that I have any individual piece of sage wisdom, but I think what we try and do through our insights is share our perspective on a specific headline topic. And we put those out 5 or 6 times a year, and you can find them either on our website or on our LinkedIn page. And what we're trying to do is just get a conversation going. Again, we're sharing our perspective, not saying that we are flat out right on anything, but we're taking a thoughtful approach to answering questions. So if that's something that would be of interest, I definitely highly recommend that the listeners here would check them out.
Yeah, and we'll put a pin in that because we'll be happy to share it in the description of the podcast if anybody'd like to follow the link. And I'll even give y'all a free plug there too. Y'all put out a really good research piece probably 6 or so months ago now that I think about it, but it was looking at Class A apartments and both the resilience of that part of the industry, more importantly, the upside of that part of the industry as we continue forward through the 2020s. And I thought it was a really good researchy piece. Now, obviously, I'm a little bit of a data nerd, so my perspective skews towards that. But, I think it was this is the kind of stuff that I think, more people in our industry should be aware of, and these independent research pieces that are put out. So we'll be sure to put a pin in that in the about section of the podcast. But Steve, again, thank you so much for your time. Really, really gracious of you to join, and grateful to have you. And again, hopefully we get to cross paths again here soon.
I'm sure we will. And I appreciate the invite, Carl. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.